Afternoon, Warsaw. How are you? So I thought I'd start off with just the Wikipedia entry for web accessibility. I think the most important part of this definition is that all users should have equal access to information and functionality. So when Sir Tim Berners-Lee tweeted from the opening of the London 2012 Olympic Games, he tweeted, "This is for everyone." He, of course, was talking about the internet. In the sort of late 80s, when he was setting up the protocols for what would become the modern internet as we know, it was a way of linking documentation and sharing knowledge. And I think that it doesn't matter how many GIFs we upload to the internet, that still is kind of the prevalent part of the internet is still we need to share information. The social networks, hands up for MySpace users, the news, the education, the tutorial sites, and the workshops, we put it up there for everyone, right? And there are things that we can do as our part as developers and designers and UXers to ensure that everybody has, an equal opportunity to gain access to this stuff. So the current state of accessibility kind of feels a bit like it kind of feels like we kind of gave up, a lot like this Star Trek movie. For those who don't know, in this Star Trek movie, someone decided that Captain Kirk should direct it and that he was going to fight God. I think there's some of us who kind of half do it, who kind of understand it, some of us who really just have no idea of how to implement some basic accessibility things. And there's probably some people who think it's a difficult thing to do. And maybe that's just part of that. Maybe there's a gap in the education of building websites to be accessible. So there are a few things that we should consider when we're talking about accessibility. There are visual issues. Users with low vision, obstructive vision, or color blindness. Users with low vision might use a screen magnifier to hover over our links. And so sort of things we can do there is ensure that we have sufficient click areas and things like that. Someone who's colorblind might not be able to see the color red. So if we're building websites where the only sort of definable part of our links are that they're colored red, someone who can't see the color red can't tell what a link is. So we should consider simple things like adding an underline to a link, as much as designers will not want you to do that. Are there any designers in the room who are like more designers than developers or UX people? Cool. I'm not going to offend anyone. So a Captain Picard quick tip. Don't ever put maximum scale 1.0 on your meta viewport tag when you're doing stuff to do with the viewport. This stops a user from being able to pinch and zoom. And again, as much as people think that their designs are perfect and they have the exact right typography with the right line height and it's perfectly readable, it's not. Being able to pinch and zoom on a mobile tablet device is quite important, especially to people with low vision. So don't do that. Just set the initial scale to 1 and let people pinch and zoom to their heart's content. There are auditory issues. So often I found myself embedding videos on client sites and they haven't supplied a subtitle file, or embedding audio and they've not supplied a transcript. And it's always been a pain to try and get those sort of things. But fight for it if you're in that position. It's not a hard thing to implement as a developer. We have HTML5 track tags that do pretty well, and most like open source HTML5 video players will support a standard SRT subtitle file. And it'd be great to start seeing more video that isn't hosted on YouTube that has subtitles, and it'd be great to see things like podcasts. A lot more podcasts have transcripts. There are motor skills, so people who don't have like full control over their motor skills, and it's quite a big and important one because there's a whole range of assistive technologies that help people with motor disabilities access the web. From someone who suffers from something like RSI and uses a keyboard mostly to navigate, to someone who might use an assistive joystick or eye tracking. So again, it's with people using those sort of mouse replacements, we need to ensure that our clickable areas are easily reached and they're not fiddly. And I see a lot of really fiddly ones that are like bunched up together and hard to get out with a normal mouse. And it's hard to understand how people will use those with assistive technologies. So today I want to go through 10 things. 10 things that we can do to make the web a little bit more accessible. I'd like to see all 10 things being done. I think it's possible. If it's not, we can at least start. We can at least try. So in no particular order of importance, and before this I must warn you, I don't want you to feel bad. I'm not here to tell people off and have a go at people for not doing these things. I don't believe it's everyone's fault for not making the web more accessible, but I do believe that starting this conversation is an important thing. And I'm by no means an authority on accessibility. There are a lot of smarter people out there talking about accessibility, and I'm just kind of bringing the stuff that I've been doing over the last year with accessibility and the lessons that I've learned along the way. So you've all heard of mobile first, right? Quite a big thing, apparently. Maybe sometimes it's used as a buzzword. Maybe sometimes it's used by salespeople or recruiters. But really, it's pretty good advice because if you start building, we all know it's pretty good advice, right? If we start building by mobile, then that's a lot easier than trying to hamstring it in at the end. And often, doing mobile first, you lead to sort of like a better usability on other multiple screens because you kind of try and make your files as small as possible, your requests as small as possible. It's the same with accessibility. I honestly believe that if you do accessibility first, it's a lot easier than waiting until 2 days before the end of the project and your PM comes up to you with a WCAG 2.0 report and saying you failed everything, and then you got to try and put accessibility into the project. That's difficult. And accessibility is just usability. By making our sites a bit more accessible, we'll make them a little bit more usable. We'll discover sort of the nicer white space and the way that other areas are controlled by like clicks and keyboard accessibility. So like I said, yeah, keyboard navigation. And I know what you're thinking. Everyone thinks this. Who doesn't use a mouse, right? Does anyone here not use a mouse at all? Yeah, there are a few people. And the enterprise, people in the enterprise, they didn't use a mouse. No one once ever. I've watched TNG a lot, and well, at least on Model D and Model E, they never use a mouse. I never see anyone use a mouse or a trackball or anything like that. Vim users don't use a mouse. That's scientific fact. For personal experience, I suffer with a little bit of RSI. Where I can, I like to not use a mouse. I've never found a mouse that's comfortable, and so, for example, the BBC is a pretty nice, really accessible. I can use the keyboard to navigate it, and so you just got to think about things like if you've got a button, it should be able to take a key press event, or if you've got a carousel, you should be able to navigate it using the arrow keys. Tabbing order is pretty important. It's probably one of the most, I suppose when I speak to people about accessibility, this is the thing that they ask about a lot. So there's a HTML attribute called tab index, and what it does is it controls the flow of when someone's using a keyboard to navigate, they generally use the tab to navigate through parts of the page. So if you don't put tab index on anything, it takes whatever its semantic tabbing order is. So, for example, tabbing orders are things that get tab indexed by default are headings and links and buttons, but things that don't are divs and spans, because those elements are semantically neutral. They don't mean anything. And so to assistive technology, they just ignore them because they're not in the tab index. Tab index 0 will put that element into the natural tabbing order of the page, of the document. And so it will just sit wherever it sits in the hierarchy of your document. That's where it will sit. And you can use tab index 0 on everything that doesn't have it. So if you do have to use divs and spans as buttons, if you can, don't. But I understand that sometimes you don't have that control. Or the designs, you can't just use a button element. For most things, you can use a button element. Use a button if you can. But if you can't, use tab index 0. If you use a positive integer in tab index, and it doesn't stop at 99. It goes beyond that. First of all, think about what you're doing, because you are entering a world of pain if you start using positive integers. What this does is this allows you to completely control the tab flow. So you can, sequentially tab through anything. The only time I've ever seen a use case for this is like a massive form that needed certain styles to look a certain way, because that's the way that PHP gave back the HTML. And so use tab index with integers sequentially to define a tabbing order. Tab index -1 is pretty much your best friend right now. This allows an element to be programmatically focusable using the JavaScript focus function. This means that you can respond to a key press and you can send focus to another element. It's pretty good for when you're creating things like your custom select boxes. If you can't use a default select box for whatever reason and you have to use divs with spans inside or something like that, you're going to want to use tab index -1 to be able to programmatically focus on certain parts of that form. Or if you absolutely insist that you pop up a modal the minute I land on your website, at least send the focus to the modal so I can close it. Because actually, I couldn't click outside of the body. I couldn't hit escape, which is kind of like a general thing that you can hit escape and close a modal. I had to find the X, and on here you might be able to see it, but it's actually really badly. You can barely see it. I don't know if that was done on purpose. I don't know if some marketer decided that was the way to do it. But yeah, if you open up a modal, send the focus to that modal. There are massive sites out there, Instagram.com. You can't navigate with just the keyboard because it doesn't send the focus to the modal when you open up the photo. And it's kind of annoying. Please stop disabling the outline on the focus. I know that designers hate it. The really light neon blue outline that you get in WebKit browsers, it doesn't have to be blue. Some people don't realize that. It's really important for people with keyboard navigation only that we can tell where we are on the page. A lot of sites you just plainly just have no idea where you are. A good rule of thumb is use whatever the hover state is for buttons on the focus element. Is cool. On form fields, use an outline or use a border. Just need on navigation items, use a border or an outline, something that doesn't break up your box model. It's super important. And it's super annoying when I have no idea where I am. Number 8, skip navigation links. Sort of comes into the keyboard navigation area of things, but I think it sort of deserves its own show. It's something that everyone here, if you're working on a project, you could probably go away and put this in tonight into your code base. And it's something that makes things a little bit easier. And all it is the first focusable element in your body is a link that's pointing to the main content, or wherever you think that the user wants to go on that page. And it can skip repeatable content. So, for example, you might have a nav that repeats everywhere on your site. It's a pretty standard pattern. As a keyboard user, I don't want to tab 6 times every time I land on a new page. So being able to just skip that navigation or skip any repeatable content is pretty handy. You'll see it. You'll see it on sites that really do accessibility well. Number 7, alt tags. Alt tags is one of those things that you're told about as a developer when you start, and you kind of just forget a few years later. And then when you get that WCAG 2.0 report from your PM, you go, oh yeah, alt tags, I'm supposed to put those in, right? But what am I supposed to do with them? Every time I see one of those reports, alt tags is like 80% of that report, and it's forgotten alt tags or things like that. So the alt tag is meant to help the user understand what the content is, and it's not just something that's used by assistive technologies. Some people, when they're in different countries, turn off images on their browser because they don't want to download images while they're on roaming. But you can still use the alt text for descriptive reasons. So if you have to use an image for something that's purely decorative and you have to have the image in line of your code, put in the alt tag, but leave it as a blank string. That tells the assistive technology to skip over this. It knows that. It's pretty smart. The second one is something that's part of the content. Just have something descriptive. If you work with people who write copy, they can usually help. Try to stay away from things like picture of or image of, because assistive technology will help out with that. If you don't put an alt tag in there, the assistive technology will read out the file name of the image, and sometimes it's not as nice as those file names. Sometimes they can just be long gobbledygook strings. Number 6, forms. Forms by default are pretty good for accessibility, but we like to change them. The few things you can do as a developer is make sure that forms have like a really cool natural tabbing order. You're not sort of putting postcode before first line of address and things like that in the markup, because it doesn't care about CSS. But labels are massively important. I see a lot of forms that don't use labels at all. What they think is that placeholders will suffice. They won't. Labels are needed for people who use screen readers, for people who use Braille outputs and other types of outputs. They just need the labels. They need them like assigned to each other. They need to be there. What you can actually do is, if your designer doesn't want labels in their form, most UI frameworks use something like this, which is to visually hide the label or anything, but it remains in the flow of the document. So technology can pick that up and read it out. Don't think that display none is a good thing, because display none removes that, removes it from the flow, and it won't read the label out. I inevitably always get the question, is there any way we can detect someone using a screen reader or some sort of assistive technology with JavaScript? And I'm not too sure how I feel about that, because I don't think that's the solution. So no, not as far as I know. I have some ideas of how we can detect how many people are using assistive technology on our websites, and if you want to talk about that afterwards or at the party tomorrow, I'm more than happy to talk about that. I don't think you should be thinking about a separate layout for assistive technology. I don't think that's the answer. So ARIA allows us to extend HTML. We can have additional attributes. We can add additional attributes to elements to help assistive technology. You've got ARIA roles, which let you let assistive technology know what this element is supposed to be doing, and you've got states and properties, which can communicate state of an element. On Friday, Leonie Watson is doing a talk, so make sure that you attend that, because she's going to dive into ARIA a bit more and how to use it, and how to use it well. Landmarks are specific roles assigned to element, and what they do is they allow people to jump to them using assistive technology. So you'd have things like headers and navigation and things like that. so people who use any sort of assistive technology can jump in between those. And again, on Friday, I'm sure Leonie will talk about that as well. I mentioned before that if we're using media on a page, we should also provide subtitles. And again, with audio, we should provide transcripts. Hands up if you really, really hate when video auto-loads and auto-plays on a site. Not the Bay of Pirates, but any other site. It's annoying, right? Imagine if audio was your only way of navigating the web, and that happened. Yeah, don't do that. I've never come across any business requirement that validates auto-playing a video. That's either auto-playing a video when you land on a page, you're scrolling down a website and a video should autoplay with sound. No, user controls are good enough, and using the technology we have to play a video in a browser, it suffices. All users know how to click a play button. So no more auto-playing video. I'd like to not see that. Number 2, testing. We all love testing, right? It's awesome. Everyone does it. This isn't just about unit testing, or there's some interesting ideas around how you unit test HTML for ARIA. Doing all of these things that I've mentioned is fine, but testing is an important part of that. We need to use screen readers. We all have screen readers built in. I can show you how to. I'll show you in a sec about that. But we also need to quickly test with a keyboard. If we build a feature, put it through its paces. If we're working on a pull request from a colleague and they're not adding an alt tag, just educate them. You don't need to be an arsehole about it, but just tell them, explain why, and the circle will continue. We need to make sure we pass on that information. And the last thing is we kind of need to talk about it a bit more. We need to talk about it with our peers. We need to talk about it with our managers. We need to talk about it with our companies. And I'd like to see more talks on accessibility at conferences. There are conferences that are aimed specifically at accessibility, but I think more sort of regular developer conferences need to have accessibility talks, because it's an important part of getting the message out there and working together to fill in the gaps that exist at the moment. So I've had a few digs at designers, but there are some things that you just can't fix as a developer. There are some things that you just can't, add a tag for or do. Design and UX is something can be something that's totally out of your hand. That doesn't mean that you can't help educate. Color and contrast are an interesting thing in accessibility that I can't talk about because I'm not a very good designer. But it's certainly something that gets looked over a lot. And then there are a lot of interesting things around typography and the type of fonts that we use on our websites and how people with cognitive issues interpret those fonts. And it would be interesting to hear more people talk about that. So my last Picard quick tip is Jquery Ui. You might have heard of it. They got a pretty good standard for accessibility, like one of the best. So they always ensure that their widgets are accessible, as accessible as they can be. And if you ever wonder how to make things like tabs or carousels accessible, or how they handle keyboard navigation and focus and things like that, it's well worth checking out if you're building in components. And being open source, you can just look at the source code. So we all love tooling. What tooling is there around accessibility? Accessibility developer tools, it's a Chrome add-on. There's also the equivalent available for Firefox. I don't know if there's one for IE. Hopefully, like Edge will have some cool accessibility tools. But accessibility developer tools, you can run an audit, much like you might run a performance audit, and it gives you a nice report back, and it tells you, you're missing some labels on these forms, or you're missing some alt tags on these. And it also comes with a nice, in this view, you can hover over your element, and here you can see the accessibility properties that element would have, which is really handy. I've spoken a little bit about the document flow. For accessibility tools, this is what the tree looks like for assistive technology. This is what they read and what they pass. You probably don't want to dive into this straight away, but knowing that it's available, the Chrome flag thing for accessibility, you're able to check any tab that's open to look at the accessibility, and you can look at things like when buttons are focused or when buttons have certain attributes to them. As you journey further into accessibility, it's something that can come in handy. There are tools like Access Lint. Dumping a URL gives you a report back on things that are missing, much like an audit. It's got a nice report back functionality. Tenant.io, again, is another audit tool, but this one actually has an API that you could integrate in with your continuous integration or build scripts or your QAs if they're using some sort of automation tooling. You fire off to the API, it sends back some JSON with the report, and that can be shown anywhere. So beyond these tools that can test their code, you might want to, like I said, start looking at screen readers. If you use a Mac, you have a screen reader for free. There is a screen reader for most Linux distributions. On Windows, there are a few. Some of them are free. NVDA and JAWS. JAWS is a paid for, but you can have the free trial. You just have to restart it every 40 minutes or so. It's worth the time, worth investing the time in these tools, just to understand it a little bit. Spend an hour every month looking at a screen reader, learning how other people access the web. So some resources. I know that W3 specs aren't the greatest reads in the world, but they're still a better love story than Twilight. The W3 on ARIA is definitely worth a read. It's something that I look at all the time just to remind myself what something can do, what you can achieve with it. It's actually quite amazing. The A11Y project was a community effort to make accessibility a little bit more accessible. It's kind of died down recently, which is a shame. There hasn't been as many pull requests, but it has still got a great list of resources for things like articles and blogs on different types of accessibility. Various companies, such as Google and Facebook, publish their the way that they use accessibility within themselves. So Facebook talk about how they use it in markup and how they use it in native technology as well. Tons of awesome talks. If you can, check out any of those. I've made a YouTube playlist that I add to every couple of weeks when I see a good talk on accessibility that if you want to dive into it a bit more, highly recommend. And we need to make sure we go from this guy, which is Season 1 Riker with no beard, and he's boring, and to awesome Riker with a beard. Yeah, that's all we need to do. We just need to enjoy what we do and be a little bit more awesome. So my name's Shaun. I work for a company called Batika.com out of London in the UK. You can normally find me online under Shaun Dunne. And thanks very much.
Hi, Shaun. Thanks for the talk. It was really good. Here.
Hey.
Hi. I recently ran a project I worked on for JAWS, and it was really overwhelming, painful to listen to, and probably a kitten died somewhere because of that.
Yeah.
I think, working in the agency world for the last few years, that part of the problem with the web being in such a, rubbish position as it is that we don't have means to communicate the level and the scale of disabilities in countries.
Right.
Because we can't track them. We can't track devices or tooling. So do you think it should be part of some sort of standardization, maybe W3C, maybe something else, maybe coming through vendors, that we could impose on them? Or is it something impossible to achieve?
I mean, it's not impossible to achieve. Like I said, there are, like, you have stats out there that are like X amount number of people are blind and X amount of people have low vision. There are possible ways to track. So I mentioned that there are possible ways to track people who might use assistive technologies. And one of my ideas is that the skip navigation link will only show, you can have it so it only shows when the focus is drawn to it. On that, you could fire off a Google Tag Manager event or something analytical and record that. And you could kind of gauge people using keyboard only. There isn't a way to, I don't think there's a way to track people using screen readers. I think that will infringe on some sort of privacy concerns and things like that in certain countries. But I think as more and more people get online, as we have things like internet.org, bringing more and more people online, especially in places where there are a lot more people who suffer with these disabilities, I think it's just important that we try and push this forward. And I understand the whole agency thing, and it's hard to push through. I worked in agencies for 8 years and left. It's kind of one of those things. It's intrinsic to the process. We have to work through it, and we need like these voices in these agencies that do X amount of work to speak up on behalf. It's kind of like do accessibility by default. That's kind of my rule of thumb. The way that I don't make anyone do accessibility. The way that, if you've ever seen like Gordon Ramsay, how he makes people really good chefs is by shouting at them and swearing at them. That doesn't work with developers. I just do it by default and kind of hope that influences them in the way that they work.
Hey, I really like your talk, but I just wanted to say that to answer to this question, there is actually a media type called speech. And it's supposed to work and to detect screen readers, but I'm not sure if it works.
Yeah, I've not come across a way that's sufficient enough.
Okay.
And like I said, it might be all right to do like modernizer feature detect on that stuff, but then I think as developers, our natural urge is to like, okay, we'll just change the layout, and it's like kind of like that's not the point.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
But I just wanted, I was just wondering.
It's
if,
not a
if
reliable.
You ever tried
it's not a reliable.
The screen reader does what the name suggests. It reads what's on the screen. So it's not for media type voice or something, but for screen.
Yeah.
Because it reads just this. And speech, okay, yeah. And I wanted to have one remark left when you said do accessibility by default. Sure, the web is accessible and it's responsive by default. Yeah. Unless we take it away with CSS or JavaScript.
Well, divs and spans aren't accessible by default because they don't get put into the flow of the document.
If you use HTML, right?
Right.
So the proper elements, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the HTML5 tags that we've seen are born out of making things like more accessible. They still require things like ARIA to make them a little bit more so.